May 1st, 305. Nicomedia. The location is a small hill a few miles from the city, the seat of imperial power in the east. The air is unnaturally still, thick with the shimmering heat of late spring and the collective held breath of thousands of legionaries assembled in perfect formation. The silence is the most terrifying thing, a vacuum where the roar of acclamation should be. It is punctuated only by the clink of metal on metal, the rustle of standards bearing the eagle of Rome and the image of Jupiter, and the frantic beating of hearts within bronze cuirasses. On a high tribunal stands a man, Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus Augustus, for 20 years the absolute master of the Roman world. He is not dressed for triumph. The purple toga, the symbol of supreme power, hangs on his weary frame not as a mantle of divinity, but as a shroud. His face, usually a mask of stern command, is ashen, etched with a profound, soul-deep exhaustion that no military victory could erase. This is not a political address. It is a funeral rite. With trembling hands, he unclasps the fibula at his shoulder. The heavy wool, dyed with the rarest murex snail, a fabric worth more than its weight in gold, slides from his body and pools at his feet. A collective gasp, sharp and involuntary, ripples through the ranks. A god is disrobing. He is renouncing his own divinity, an act so alien to the Roman psyche, so contrary to the very nature of power, that it feels like a violation of the natural order of the cosmos. This single, deliberate gesture shatters a century of precedent, where emperors left the throne only through assassination or natural death. He is walking away from it all, alive and undefeated, an act of political suicide that is simultaneously his final, most audacious act of creation. The penetrating chill of the moment is not in the air, but in the minds of all who witness it. If a god can choose to be mortal, what foundation is truly secure? This was the beginning of the end of his story, and the beginning of his eternal paradox. This is the narrative of him, Diocletian, the man who inherited a corpse and bequeathed an empire. This is the saga of a peasant's son who became a living god, only to seek solace in the soil. To understand this man, to grasp the sheer magnitude of his final act, we must ask the question that hung in the stunned air of Nicomedia and has perplexed history for 17 centuries. Why? Why did Rome's greatest reformer, the architect of its salvation, the man who held the fate of 60 million souls in his hands, walk away to grow cabbages? What force, weariness, philosophy, fear, or a final, inscrutable calculation could compel the Caesar who had achieved a form of eternity to refuse it? The answer is not simple, for it is not the story of one man's decision, but the culmination of a lifetime spent staring into the abyss of civilization's collapse. He was a man who had seen the end of the world and had single-handedly pushed it back over the horizon. His abdication was not an epilogue to his reign. It was its logical, terrifying, and necessary conclusion. He built a machine designed to run forever, and to prove its perfection, he had to remove its creator. He did not lose power. He transcended it, leaving behind a legacy of order so absolute that it bordered on tyranny, and a personal mystery so profound that it borders on the divine. The search for this answer does not begin with the emperor on the tribunal, but in the world of fire, blood, and chaos that forged him, the world he was born to tame or be devoured by. It was a world that had forgotten what peace even felt like, and it was this world that would define his every action, from his first murder to his final shocking farewell. To understand Diocletian, We must first return to the world of the mid-3rd century, a geopolitical nightmare that historians would later call the crisis. This was not a period of decline. It was a complete, systemic, and violent breakdown of the Roman state. The empire was a wounded giant, staggering and bleeding from 1,000 self-inflicted wounds, surrounded by circling predators. On the macro level, the great game of nations had devolved into a desperate scramble for survival. In the west, the Rhine-Danube frontier, once the impregnable shield of civilization, was now a porous membrane through which poured a constant stream of Germanic tribes, Franks, Alemanni, Goths, driven by climate change and their own internal pressures. They did not just raid, they settled, carving out chunks of Roman territory in Gaul and the Balkans. In the east, the threat was even greater. The Parthian dynasty had been replaced by the far more aggressive and centralized Sasanian Empire of Persia, a superpower that saw itself as Rome's equal and rightful heir to Alexander's eastern conquests. The struggle was not over border forts, but over entire civilizations in Mesopotamia and Armenia. Internally, the situation was pure chaos. The Roman economy had utterly collapsed into a state of hyperinflation, where the silver denarius was now a worthless copper coin with a thin wash of silver. The state paid its armies by minting more and more debased currency, rendering savings, contracts, and trade meaningless. A plague, likely smallpox, had swept through the empire a generation earlier, killing millions and shattering the demographic and tax base. But the true engine of the crisis was the Roman army itself. The legions no longer served the state. The state existed only to serve the legions. In the 50 years before Diocletian's ascension, there were more than 20 so-called barracks emperors, generals proclaimed by their troops, who would typically reign for a few months before being murdered by those same troops in favor of a new challenger who promised a larger donative. The empire was a snake eating its own tail, a civil war machine that produced nothing but corpses and emperors. This was the world Diocletian inherited. Not a functioning state, but a failed one, a geographic expression on the verge of splintering into a dozen warring successor kingdoms. It was a world screaming for a ruler with the ambition of a Caesar, the discipline of a drill sergeant, and the brutal pragmatism of a frontier butcher. Into this maelstrom of collapse, a boy named Diocles was born, around the year 244, in the Roman province of Dalmatia, the modern Croatian coast. His origins are the first key to understanding his psychology. He was not a product of Rome, of the Senate, of the ancient patrician families who believed they were born to rule. He was a creature of the Illyrian frontier, a harsh, rugged, and heavily militarized landscape that served as the primary recruiting ground for the late Roman army. This was a world that bred soldiers, not politicians. Official histories, written later, would attempt to invent a noble lineage for him, but the truth was far humbler and more revealing. His father was likely a scribe, and more importantly, a freedman, a former slave. This social stigma, the faint but undeniable taint of servitude in his ancestry, would have been a constant factor in the class-conscious Roman world. It meant he had no inherited wealth, no network of powerful family connections, no easy path to power. Everything he would ever achieve would have to be earned through raw talent, ruthless ambition, and unbending will. His character was forged in the cold, damp barracks of the Danube frontier, not the warm, marble-clad villas of Italy. He learned leadership not from studying rhetoric and philosophy, but from commanding men in brutal skirmishes against the Sarmatians and Goths. This world taught him 3 vital lessons that would define his reign. First, loyalty was a commodity, bought with victory and pay, not an innate virtue. Second, problems were not to be debated, but solved, quickly, efficiently, and often violently. Third, and most importantly, the complex, messy traditions of the old Roman Republic were an irrelevant luxury. The intricate dance between the Senate and the princeps, the legal fictions established by Augustus, meant nothing to a soldier on a frozen riverbank fighting for his life. This background created a man of supreme pragmatism, unburdened by ideology or sentiment. He saw the empire not as a sacred inheritance of laws and customs, but as a broken war machine that needed a master mechanic. He was the ultimate outsider, and it was precisely because he was not invested in the old ways that he alone would possess the vision and the ruthlessness to discard them entirely. The ascent of a low-born Illyrian soldier to the imperial throne was a journey written in blood, intrigue, and a singular, decisive act of violence that propelled him from obscurity to absolute power. Diocles, as he was still known, had risen steadily through the ranks, a testament to his military competence and political acumen. He served under the emperors Probus and Carus, eventually becoming the commander of the Protectores Domestici, the elite imperial bodyguard. This position placed him at the very heart of power, a silent observer of the deadly game of thrones. In the year 284, he was on campaign in Persia with Emperor Numerian. The campaign concluded, but on the long march back, a strange and ominous event occurred. The emperor, complaining of an eye inflammation, secluded himself in a closed litter. For days the army marched with its unseen ruler, a foul smell gradually beginning to emanate from the imperial carriage. Finally, suspicious soldiers opened the curtains to find Numerian's decomposing corpse. He had been dead for days. Suspicion immediately fell upon the Praetorian prefect, Arrius Aper, Numerian's father-in-law, a man with the means, motive, and opportunity to commit murder and seize power. A tribunal of generals and tribunes was convened near Nicomedia to decide the fate of the empire. One by one, they ruled out other candidates, their eyes settling on Diocles, a man respected for his steady hand and strong will. He was proclaimed Augustus by the soldiers, but the matter of Aper was unresolved. On November 20th, 284, Diocles ascended the tribunal. Before the assembled army, with the sun glinting off thousands of helmets, he swore an oath to the sun god, Sol Invictus, that he was innocent of Numerian's death. Then, pointing a finger at Aper, who stood beside him in chains, he declared him the murderer. Without waiting for a trial, without uttering another word of judgment, he drew his sword. The blade, wielded by the new emperor, flashed in the light. In one smooth, powerful motion, he plunged it directly into Aper's heart, killing him instantly. This was not just an execution, it was a foundational act. He was demonstrating to the entire world that he was a man of immediate and terrible action. He was both judge and executioner, the embodiment of a new kind of authority, blunt, swift, and absolute. With that single sword thrust, the boy named Diocles died, and the emperor Diocletian was born. The inner demon that drove Diocletian, the secret motivation that fueled his 20-year quest to reshape the world, was not a simple lust for power or a thirst for personal glory. Men who desire such things do not voluntarily relinquish them. His driving force was something far more profound and psychological, a deep-seated, almost pathological hatred of chaos. His entire life had been lived within the crucible of the 3rd century crisis. He was not a man who had read about civil war and anarchy in history books. He had lived it, breathed it, and survived it. He had seen emperors rise and fall like shooting stars, their reigns measured in months. He had seen the frontiers collapse, cities burn, and the economic lifeblood of the empire turn to worthless dust. This experience did not make him ambitious. It made him obsessive. He was haunted by the visceral fear that the entire edifice of Roman civilization, a structure 1,000 years in the building, was on the brink of a final, irreversible collapse. Every usurper was a symptom of the disease, every barbarian incursion a death spasm, every worthless coin a step closer to the grave. This fear became an all-consuming mission, to impose order. Not just to win battles or stabilize the currency, but to create a system so rigid, so powerful, and so logically sound that the chaos could never return. He viewed the empire as an architect views a failing building. He saw the cracks in the foundation, the rot in the support beams, and the crumbling facade. His goal was to demolish the unstable parts and rebuild it with steel and granite, no matter the human cost. This explains the relentless, almost inhuman energy of his reforms. They were not piecemeal solutions, but a totalizing vision for a controlled state. He wanted to regulate everything: prices, jobs, religion, even the succession of emperors, because anything left to chance was a potential entry point for the chaos he so despised. His demon was the specter of entropy, the tendency of all complex systems to decay. His entire reign can be understood as a desperate, brilliant, and ultimately brutal war against the forces of historical entropy. He wasn't just trying to rule the world, he was trying to freeze it in a perfect, crystalline structure of his own design, to stop the river of time itself. This obsessive need for control is what made him a genius reformer, but it also contained the seeds of his greatest failures and, paradoxically, his eventual departure. Almost immediately upon seizing power, Diocletian demonstrated the radical pragmatism that would define his reign. He understood a truth that had eluded his dozens of short-lived predecessors. The Roman Empire had become too large, its problems too numerous and too widespread, for one man to govern alone. The throne had become a tomb precisely because it was solitary. An emperor campaigning on the Rhine could not simultaneously deal with a usurper in Syria and a Persian invasion in Mesopotamia. To be in one place was to be fatally absent from another. In the summer of 285, less than a year after his acclamation, Diocletian made a revolutionary decision. He looked not for a subordinate, but for a partner. His choice fell upon Maximian, a fellow Illyrian officer. Maximian was the perfect foil for Diocletian. He was coarse, uncultured, and possessed of a violent temper, but he was also a brilliant and brutally effective general, and most importantly, he was loyal. Diocletian trusted him implicitly. He elevated Maximian first to the rank of Caesar, and then, in 286, to the full rank of Augustus, a co-emperor with power nominally equal to his own. He entrusted the turbulent West, Gaul, Britain, Spain, and the Rhine frontier, to Maximian, while he retained control of the wealthier and more strategic East. This was the birth of the Diarchy, the rule of two. It was an act of political genius that flew in the face of centuries of Roman tradition, where the sharing of supreme power was seen as a prelude to civil war. For Diocletian, it was simple, brutal logic. He was dividing the labor, not the empire. He had diagnosed the core problem, the impossibility of centralized command in a world on fire, and had prescribed the necessary, if shocking, solution. This fateful alliance was the first pillar of his new order. It immediately doubled the imperial presence, allowing one Augustus to fight the Alemanni while the other planned a campaign against Persia. It was a partnership founded not on affection, but on mutual respect and a shared understanding of the desperate situation. Diocletian would be the strategist, the grand architect of policy, while Maximian would be the hammer, the blunt instrument of imperial will. This decision to share the ultimate prize revealed the true nature of Diocletian's ambition. It was not for personal power, but for the survival of the state. He was willing to sacrifice singular glory for the sake of stability, the first of many radical choices on his path to remaking the world. The first years of the new diarchy were a relentless trial by fire, a desperate empire-wide struggle to extinguish the flames of rebellion and invasion that had been raging for half a century. The price of power was to be paid daily in blood and iron, on a dozen different fronts. Maximian, the newly minted Augustus of the West, was immediately dispatched to Gaul to confront a terrifying and symptomatic threat: the Bagaudai. These were not foreign invaders, but desperate Roman citizens, peasants, tenant farmers, army deserters, who had been crushed by ruinous taxation, debt, and the devastation of constant civil war. They had risen up in a massive jacquerie, a furious peasant revolt that rejected Roman authority entirely. They were a symptom of the empire's internal rot, a sign that the state was now preying on its own people. Maximian crushed them with the merciless brutality for which he was chosen. The fields of Gaul ran red with the blood of Roman peasants, a grim necessity to restore the order of the landlords and tax collectors. This was the price of power. To save the state, one must first slaughter its most desperate subjects. At the same time, Diocletian was engaged in his own struggles along the vast Danube frontier. He campaigned relentlessly against the Sarmatians and other tribes, not for conquest, but for containment. His goal was to restore the sanctity of the borders, to re-establish the fear and respect that had once been the empire's greatest defense. These were not glorious wars of expansion like those of Trajan or Caesar. They were a grim, grinding, and unending work of maintenance, like a homeowner constantly patching a leaking roof in a hurricane. Every victory was temporary, every peace treaty fragile. The pressure was immense and unending. While Maximian fought rebels and Germans in the west, Diocletian was forced to shuttle back and forth to the east, dealing with tribal incursions from the Goths and managing the ever-present threat of Persia. The sheer scale of the task was overwhelming even for two rulers. It was a constant, frantic race against time and chaos, a multi-front war where the prize was not glory, but mere survival. These brutal early years cemented in Diocletian's mind the core truth that his initial reform, the diarchy, was itself insufficient. He and his partner were winning battles, but they were losing the war against the fundamental instability of their world. A greater, more radical solution was needed. While the diarchy battled to stabilize the frontiers and crush internal revolts, the true long-term threat loomed on the eastern horizon. The antagonist on the macro level was not a disorganized barbarian horde, but a sophisticated, ancient, and powerful civilization, the Sasanian Empire of Persia. For centuries, Rome had clashed with the Parthians, but the Sasanians, who had overthrown them in the early 3rd century, were a different kind of enemy. They were more centralized, more ideologically driven by their Zoroastrian faith, and possessed a formidable military machine, particularly their elite heavy cavalry, the cataphracts. The Sasanians did not see themselves as a regional power. They viewed themselves as the inheritors of the ancient Achaemenid Empire of Cyrus and Darius, and they considered the Roman provinces of the Near East to be rightfully theirs. This was not a border dispute. It was a clash of two world orders, a struggle for geopolitical supremacy that had been draining Rome's resources for generations. The symbolic and strategic prize was control over Mesopotamia and the client kingdom of Armenia, which served as a critical buffer state between the two empires. Under powerful kings like Shapur I, who had captured the Roman Emperor Valerian in battle a generation earlier, a humiliation that scarred the Roman psyche, Persia had repeatedly proven itself capable of inflicting devastating defeats upon the legions. For Diocletian, the Sasanian threat was the ultimate test of his new system. It required immense logistical planning, the raising of vast armies, and a level of strategic focus that was impossible while also dealing with chaos in Europe. The Persian front was a voracious consumer of manpower and gold, a constant drain on an already bankrupt state. This geopolitical reality shaped Diocletian's grand strategy. He understood that he could not be the master of the Roman world if his eastern flank was perpetually insecure. He needed a decisive, lasting victory over Persia to secure the resources and prestige necessary to complete his internal reforms. The conflict with the Sasanians was more than a war. It was the crucible in which his most ambitious political creation, the Tetrarchy, would be forged. The shadow of Persia forced his hand, compelling him to realize that even two emperors were not enough to manage a world in perpetual conflict. In the midst of the struggle to re-establish Roman dominance, the new system faced its first terrifying moment of fallibility, a psychological breaking point that revealed the fragility of the restored order. The crisis erupted on the Persian front. In 296, Diocletian appointed his junior emperor, the Caesar Galerius, to lead a major campaign against the Sasanian Shah Narseh. Galerius was a man of immense ambition and brutal energy, a younger version of Diocletian himself, but he was also impetuous. Advancing hastily into Mesopotamia without proper reconnaissance, he engaged the main Persian army near Karhay, the same ground where Crassus and his legions had been annihilated centuries before. The result was a catastrophic defeat. The Roman army was routed, its eagles captured, its commander forced into a humiliating flight. The defeat was a devastating blow, not just militarily, but ideologically. Diocletian had carefully constructed a new imperial image, styling himself as Jovius, descended from Jupiter, and Maximian as Herculeus. They were presented to the world not as mere men, but as gods on earth, invincible and infallible. Galerius's defeat shattered this carefully crafted aura of divine favor. It proved that the new rulers could bleed, fail, and be humbled, just like their ill-fated predecessors. Diocletian's reaction was cold, calculated, and theatrical. When the defeated Galerius finally met him, Diocletian did not offer solace. Instead, he forced his Caesar, still clad in the imperial purple, to walk for a full mile in front of his imperial chariot, a public and deeply personal shaming. This act served a dual purpose. It was a brutal lesson for Galerius in caution and humility, but more importantly, it was a piece of political theater for the entire empire. It demonstrated that Diocletian, the senior Augustus, was still in absolute command. He was the master of the system, the Jupiter to his subordinates' lesser roles, and he would hold even his chosen heirs accountable for failure. Yet this event must have deeply shaken Diocletian himself. It was the first major crack in his new edifice. It taught him that his system, as revolutionary as it was still dependent on the fallible judgments of men. The experience hardened his resolve, reinforcing his belief that only a more rigid, more comprehensive, and more tightly controlled structure could truly safeguard the empire from the fatal combination of external enemies and internal human error. The humiliation in Persia and the unceasing pressure on multiple fronts acted as the catalyst for Diocletian's most famous and audacious innovation. He recognized that the chaos of the empire was not just a matter of enemies, but of scale. The world was simply too big, its frontiers too long, its problems too numerous for even two rulers to manage effectively. The Diarchy had been a brilliant improvisation, but it was not a permanent solution. So, in an act of breathtaking political creativity, Diocletian decided to expand upon his initial idea. On March 1st, 293, he transformed the Diarchy into the Tetrarchy, the rule of 4. He and Maximian, the two senior emperors, would retain the title of Augustus. Each Augustus would then adopt a junior emperor, or Caesar, who would serve as their second-in-command and designated heir. Diocletian chose the tough and ambitious Galerius as his Caesar in the east, despite his recent defeat, entrusting him with the turbulent Balkan provinces. In the west, Maximian adopted Constantius Chlorus, a respected general and governor of Dalmatia. The empire was now administratively quartered. Constantius took Britain and Gaul. Maximian retained Italy, Spain, and Africa. Galerius held the Danube frontier, and Diocletian kept the strategic heartland of the east, Thrace, Asia Minor, and Egypt. This was not a formal division of the empire. Sovereignty remained indivisible. It was a radical division of labor. Now there was an emperor within striking distance of every major flashpoint. A fire on the Rhine could be handled by Constantius without pulling Maximian away from Africa. A Gothic incursion on the Danube could be met by Galerius, while Diocletian planned the next move against Persia. Even more brilliantly, the Tetrarchy was designed to solve the fatal problem of succession that had plagued Rome for a century. The Caesars were not the sons of the Augusti by blood, but by adoption and merit. The plan was that when the senior Augusti retired, the two Caesars would be elevated to their place, and they, in turn, I'd adopt two new Caesars. It was a self-perpetuating college of emperors, a machine designed to eliminate the bloody free-for-all that traditionally followed an emperor's death. Diocletian had taken the chaos of a fractured world and imposed upon it a structure of crystalline mathematical logic. It was his greatest gamble, an attempt to rationalize power itself. The ultimate vindication of the tetrarchic system, its moment of greatest triumph, came, fittingly, on the very same front that had earlier produced its most humiliating failure. The sting of defeat at the hands of the Persians had festered in Galerius. In 298, armed with a new army reinforced by veterans from the Danube legions and burning with a desire to redeem his honor, he launched a new invasion of the Sasanian Empire. This time, he did not repeat his mistake. Learning his lesson in humility and strategy, he advanced cautiously through the mountainous terrain of Armenia, a landscape that favored Roman infantry over Persian heavy cavalry. The result was one of the most decisive victories in Roman history. Galerius orchestrated a surprise night attack on the camp of the Persian Shah Narse. The assault was a complete success. The Persian army was scattered, and Narse himself was wounded and forced to flee the field. But the true prize lay in what he left behind. Galerius's legions captured the Shah's entire treasury, his royal camp, and most importantly, his harem, including his wives, sisters, and children. The capture of the royal family was a blow of immense psychological and political significance, a source of profound shame for the Persian king. This was the mirror image of Valerian's capture by Shapur. The Romans treated their royal captives with honor, a calculated act of chivalry that further highlighted Narse's defeat. The victory was total. A humbled Narse was forced to the negotiating table, where Diocletian, as the senior Augustus, dictated the terms. The resulting Treaty of Nisibis was a triumph for Rome. Persia ceded a vast swath of territory in northern Mesopotamia, recognized Roman control over the contested kingdom of Armenia, and effectively acknowledged Roman supremacy in the region. The eastern frontier, for decades a source of instability and dread, was now secure. The victory sent a thunderous message across the known world. The Roman Empire was back. The Tetrarchy was not just a convoluted administrative arrangement. It was a potent war-making machine, capable of projecting overwhelming power and achieving decisive results. For Diocletian, this was the zenith of his creation, the moment his grand, logical design was proven in the crucible of war. The chaos had been tamed. At the pinnacle of his power, with the frontiers secure and his system triumphant, Diocletian embarked on the most ambitious part of his project, the reformation of the emperor's image itself. He understood that military and economic reforms were not enough. To truly end the cycle of chaos and usurpation, he had to elevate the Principate of Augustus into something entirely different, something distant, sacred, and unassailable. This was the creation of the Dominate. The emperor was no longer the princeps, the first citizen among equals. He was the Dominus et Deus, the Lord and God. This was his moment of supreme hubris, but it was a calculated and deeply political hubris. He consciously shed the last vestiges of republican tradition. The easygoing accessibility of earlier emperors was replaced with a rigid and elaborate court ceremonial, much of it borrowed directly from his defeated Persian rivals. Audiences with Diocletian became liturgical events. Visitors, regardless of rank, were required to perform proskinesis, prostrating themselves fully on the ground before him. He wore robes of purple silk and gold, and his shoes were studded with precious gems. He was surrounded by a sea of court eunuchs and bureaucrats, creating a buffer between his divine person and the profane world of ordinary mortals. This was not mere vanity. It was a deliberate political strategy to raise the emperor above the army. For a century, emperors had been made and unmade by their soldiers, viewed as little more than successful generals. By making himself a god, Diocletian was attempting to make himself untouchable, to place the imperial office beyond the grasp of ambitious commanders. To murder the emperor would no longer be a mere political act. It would be sacrilege. To support this new ideology, he and Maximian adopted their divine titles. Diocletian became Jovius, the earthly representative of Jupiter, the king of the gods, the thinker, the planner. Maximian became Herculeus, the incarnation of Hercules, the tireless hero who executed the will of the gods on earth. This divine kinship infused the entire Tetrarchy with a sacred aura. They were a college of gods, ruling by divine grace. In his own mind, Diocletian likely saw this not as a personal aggrandizement, but as a necessary fiction, the final piece of the puzzle. He had rebuilt the empire's body with his military and administrative reforms. Now, he was giving it a new soul, a religion of the state with himself as its chief deity. Even as the Tetrarchy reached its zenith, the system was being challenged by the very disease it was designed to cure: usurpation. The figure of Carausius, the pirate emperor of Britain, stands as Diocletian's most persistent and personal antagonist. Carausius was a man of humble origins from Belgic Gaul, a brilliant naval commander who had been tasked by Maximian with clearing the English Channel of Frankish and Saxon pirates. He was remarkably successful, but rumors soon began to circulate that he was keeping the captured treasure for himself and colluding with the pirates he was supposed to be fighting. Hearing that Maximian had ordered his execution, Carausius took a desperate gamble. In 286, he used his fleet and his loyal troops to seize control of Britain and the northern coast of Gaul, declaring himself a third Augustus alongside Diocletian and Maximian. This was a direct, personal affront to Diocletian's vision of a unified and orderly world. Carausius was not some distant barbarian king. He was a Roman officer, a product of the very system he now defied. For nearly 7 years, he ruled his breakaway Britannic Empire. He was a remarkably able administrator, minting his own high-quality coins, an implicit critique of the debased currency on the continent, and building up a powerful navy that made an invasion of Britain impossible for Maximian. Carausius was a psychological thorn in Diocletian's side. He represented the enduring appeal of regional power and personal ambition, the chaotic, individualistic forces that the Tetrarchy was designed to suppress. He even tried to legitimize his rule by issuing coins with the portraits of all 3 emperors, with the inscription Carausius et fratres sui, Carausius and his brothers. This was a propaganda masterstroke, an offer to be accepted into the imperial college, an idea Diocletian rejected with contempt. The standoff finally ended not by direct conquest, but through the efforts of the newly appointed Caesar, Constantius Chlorus. He first retook the Gallic territories, and in 293, Carausius was murdered by his own finance minister, Electus, who then assumed power. 3 years later, Constantius launched his invasion of Britain, crushed Electus's forces, and restored the island to the empire. The defeat of the usurper was a victory for the Tetrarchy, but the long and successful reign of Carausius had been a sobering lesson. It proved that the centrifugal forces of rebellion and ambition were still potent, and that the new system, for all its logic, was not yet immune to the old Roman sickness. With the frontiers temporarily pacified and the major usurpers defeated, Diocletian turned his formidable organizational genius inward, to the complete and total restructuring of the Roman state. If his military victories were a form of emergency surgery, these reforms were an attempt to rewrite the empire's genetic code. His primary goal was to create a stable and predictable fiscal and administrative system to fund his vastly expanded army and bureaucracy. The heart of this was the revolutionary tax system known as the capitatio iugatio. For the first time, the empire conducted a massive, comprehensive census of population and land. The land was assessed for tax purposes in units called iuga, based on its type and productivity, while the population was assessed in units called capita, heads. This allowed the state to create an annual budget, to know exactly what its revenues would be, and to impose its tax burden with relentless efficiency. It was a rational and logical system, but it had a profound and chilling social consequence. It effectively tied the rural population to their land, as peasants, coloni, were now registered to a specific plot for tax purposes. This was the beginning of the end of the free peasantry and the dawn of medieval serfdom. Next, to combat the hyperinflation that had destroyed the economy, Diocletian attempted a complete monetary overhaul, issuing new, high-purity coins. When this failed to stop the inflationary spiral, he took a more direct and drastic step. In 301, he issued the Edict on Maximum Prices, a decree that set a fixed price for over 1,000 goods and services across the empire, from the cost of wheat and sausages to the wages of a lawyer or a sewer cleaner. The penalty for violating the edict was death. It was a breathtaking act of state control, an attempt to repeal the laws of supply and demand by imperial decree. The edict was an economic disaster, leading to black markets and causing goods to vanish from sale, and it was eventually abandoned. but it revealed the core of Diocletian's governing philosophy, an unwavering belief that any problem, no matter how complex, could be solved through the application of rational, centralized, and absolute authority. Alongside these economic reforms, he completely reorganized the military, separating the border garrisons, limitani, from the elite mobile field armies, comitatenses, creating a defense-in-depth strategy. He also doubled the number of provinces to over 100, making them smaller and easier to control, and separating civil and military authority to reduce the power of governors and lessen the chance of revolt. He was not merely ruling. He was engineering a new type of state, bureaucratic, autocratic, and all-encompassing. While Diocletian was busy remaking the world into a perfectly ordered machine, his personal life remained shrouded in the imperial distance he so carefully cultivated. Yet, through the cracks in the official histories, we get glimpses of the man behind the divine facade and the context of his family life, which presented its own subtle challenges to his grand vision of pagan restoration. His wife was the Augusta Prisca, and their daughter was Valeria. Unlike the politically ambitious and often murderous women of the earlier Julio-Claudian or Severan dynasties, Prisca and Valeria appear to have been largely invisible on the political stage, living in the secluded women's quarters of the palace in Nicomedia. However, a powerful and persistent tradition, reported by Christian writers like Lactantius, suggests a hidden drama within the imperial family. Both Prisca and Valeria were rumored to be, if not baptized Christians, then at least strong sympathizers with the faith. This would have created a situation of profound irony. While the Emperor Jovius was positioning himself as the earthly vessel of Jupiter and demanding universal sacrifice to the traditional gods, his own wife and daughter may have been secretly praying to the Christian God. This hidden religious tension within his own household is a poignant onion layer, adding a layer of psychological complexity to his later decision to launch the Great Persecution. Was he partly driven by a need to control the faith of his own family? Was he angered by their private defiance of his public ideology? We can only speculate. Another crucial piece of context is the physical embodiment of his final plan. The monumental palace he began constructing at Salona, in his homeland of Dalmatia, the modern city of Split. This was no mere retirement villa. It was a massive fortified complex, laid out like a Roman military camp, part fortress, part palace, part mausoleum. Its construction, which began years before his abdication, is the clearest evidence that his retirement was not a sudden impulse born of illness, but a long-meditated, carefully planned final act. The palace was a statement in stone and mortar. It was a place of absolute security, a final refuge from the chaotic world he had spent his life trying to tame, a physical manifestation of his desire for a clean, orderly, and final conclusion to his own story. The magnificent edifice of the Tetrarchy, for all its apparent strength and logical perfection, contained inherent structural flaws, hairline cracks that would soon widen into chasms. The system's greatest and most innovative feature, the plan for a non-hereditary succession based on merit, was also its most unnatural and ultimately fatal weakness. Diocletian, the ultimate pragmatist, believed he could legislate away one of the most powerful forces in human nature: a father's desire to see his son inherit his power. While the Tetrarchy was a college of 4, there were 2 other young men of immense importance waiting in the wings, excluded from the grand design. In the west, there was Maxentius, the son of the Augustus Maximian. In the east, there was Constantine, the son of the Caesar Constantius. Both were ambitious, capable, and popular with the army. They had grown up expecting to one day rule, only to see Diocletian's new system pass them over in favor of adopted heirs. This created a powerful undercurrent of resentment and dynastic ambition that the system was simply not equipped to handle. The first harbingers of the coming storm appeared in the growing rivalries within the Tetrarchy itself. Galerius, Diocletian's Caesar, was a man of boundless ambition and a fervent, almost fanatical devotion to the traditional Roman gods. He deeply resented Constantius Chlorus in the West, viewing him as too lenient towards the Christians and a potential rival for the ultimate seniority in the system. Lactantius portrays Galerius as a constant, malevolent influence, whispering in Diocletian's ear, pushing him towards more extreme and tyrannical policies. The apparent unity of the four rulers was, in reality, a delicate and tense balancing act, held together only by the immense personal authority and willpower of Diocletian himself. He must have seen the storm clouds gathering. He could see the hungry look in the eyes of his Caesar, Galerius. He knew of the sons, Constantine and Maxentius, who were effectively hostages at his court, their ambitions growing with every passing day. The perfectly logical machine he had built was threatened by the messy, illogical, and powerful emotions of human relationships: jealousy, fatherly love, and the unquenchable thirst for personal power. The system was designed to produce stability, but it had inadvertently created a pressure cooker of competing dynasties. The decision that would forever stain Diocletian's legacy and represent the most profound psychological and political error of his reign was the launching of the Great Persecution in 303. To understand why the great architect of order made this fateful act, we must delve into his mindset and the influence of his more fanatical Caesar, Galerius. For Diocletian, the Christian Church represented the last, most stubborn pocket of chaos in his otherwise perfectly regulated state. It was a society within society, an alternative power structure with its own bishops, its own laws, its own network of communication, and its own system of charity that often rivaled that of the state. Most problematically, its members refused to perform the simple act of sacrifice to the Roman gods and the emperor's genius. For a ruler who had declared himself a living god and made the imperial cult the religious glue of his new order, this was not just impiety, it was treason. He saw their refusal not as a matter of conscience, but as sheer, obstinate sedition. The Christians, with their talk of a kingdom not of this world, their atheism towards the state gods, and their tightly knit, exclusive communities, were the ultimate non-conformists in a system that demanded total conformity. Galerius, a zealous pagan, relentlessly preyed on these fears. He argued that the army was being corrupted by Christian soldiers, and that the gods were angered by the spread of this impious superstition, threatening the security of the entire empire. The final trigger may have been an incident at a sacrifice where the pagan priests, the haruspices, claimed they could not read the omens because of the presence of Christians making the sign of the cross. For Diocletian, this was the final proof. The Christians were actively sabotaging the state's relationship with the divine powers that guaranteed its existence. Therefore, he acted with the same brutal logic he applied to all other problems. On February 24, 303, the first edict was issued from Nicomedia. It ordered the destruction of churches, the burning of scriptures, and the stripping of legal rights from Christians of high rank. It was intended as a swift, surgical strike to decapitate the church's leadership and infrastructure. He fundamentally miscalculated. He believed he was excising a tumor from the body politic, but he was instead attacking a vital organ, underestimating the faith's deep roots and its followers' profound capacity for suffering. The Great Persecution was Diocletian's greatest catastrophe, a moral and political disaster that, far from unifying the empire under a single pagan ideology, revealed the brutal limits of absolute power and inadvertently strengthened the very enemy it sought to destroy. The initial edict, intended to be relatively bloodless, quickly escalated. When fires broke out in the imperial palace in Nicomedia shortly after its promulgation, Galerius convinced the aging Diocletian that the Christians were responsible. This unleashed a new wave of edicts, each more savage than the last. The second ordered the arrest of all clergy. The third commanded that these imprisoned clergy must sacrifice to the gods or face torture. The final, horrifying edict, issued in 304, extended this command to every single Christian man, woman, and child in the empire. The machinery of the state, so brilliantly designed for tax collection and administration, was now turned to the purpose of religious coercion. The result was a patchwork of horror. In the West, under the more lenient rule of Constantius, the persecution was mild, mostly limited to the destruction of church buildings. But in the East, under Diocletian, and especially the fanatical Galerius, it was a bloodbath. The accounts of Christian writers like Eusebius and Lactantius, though undoubtedly embellished, paint a gruesome picture of torture, executions, and Christians being sent to the mines. But the state's ultimate goal, the complete eradication of the Christian faith, failed spectacularly. The brutality created martyrs, whose stories of heroic defiance in the face of suffering spread like wildfire, inspiring others and strengthening the resolve of the community. The Church, far from breaking, went underground, its networks of communication and support becoming even more resilient. The persecution exposed a fundamental flaw in Diocletian's worldview. He, the master of logistics and organization, believed he could control every aspect of human life, but he discovered he could not control the human soul. He could command a soldier to march, a peasant to pay taxes, and a bureaucrat to file reports, but he could not force a person to betray their innermost beliefs. The campaign was a colossal waste of state resources, a diversion from more pressing military threats, and it created deep social divisions that festered for years. It was the ultimate failure of his system of total order, a bloody testament to the fact that some things simply cannot be commanded. In the autumn of the year 304, in the midst of the failing persecution, the architect of the Roman world began to break down. Diocletian, now around 60 years old, had embarked on a journey from Rome to the Danube frontier. During this trip, he was struck by a severe and debilitating illness. The precise nature of the ailment is unknown, but its effects were catastrophic. He was forced to travel in a closed litter, and by the time he reached his capital of Nicomedia on November 20th, the 20th anniversary of his accession, he was so weak that he was on the verge of death. For months, the master of the world vanished from public view. The empire held its breath. Rumors swirled that he was already dead, and that his death was being concealed by his courtiers to prevent the immediate outbreak of civil war. He finally reappeared in public on March 1st, 305, but he was a changed man. The accounts describe him as emaciated, barely recognizable, a frail and broken shadow of the robust soldier who had seized power 2 decades earlier. This physical collapse seems to have triggered a profound psychological crisis. For 20 years, he had operated with the tireless energy of a man who believed he could bend the world to his will. Now, his own body had betrayed him. He was forced to confront his own mortality, and in doing so, he must have seen the mortality of his entire grand system. He had designed the Tetrarchy to be a machine that was independent of any single man, but he knew that his own towering authority was the linchpin holding it all together. From his sickbed, he would have looked out at the world he had built and seen the ambition burning in the eyes of his Caesar, Galerius, who was now effectively running the empire and was eager for the top position. He knew that Maximian in the West had no desire to retire, and he knew that the sons, Constantine and Maxentius, were waiting, like wolves, for any sign of weakness. The illness was the final catalyst. It broke his spirit and his iron will. It convinced him that he no longer had the physical strength or the mental fortitude to manage the competing egos of his colleagues and steer the ship of state through the inevitable storm that his retirement, or death, would unleash. The system's ultimate test was at hand, and he realized he could not preside over it. He had to enact his final reform, his abdication, before it was too late. The scene on the hill near Nicomedia on May 1st, 305, can now be understood in its full, tragic context. This was not the act of a weary man seeking a quiet life. It was the final, desperate gamble of a master systems builder to ensure his creation would outlive him. It was the ultimate test of the Tetrarchy. Diocletian, frail but resolute, ascended the tribunal before the silent army. He delivered a speech, his voice weak but clear, telling the soldiers that he was old and infirm and needed to rest after a lifetime of labor. He then, in a moment of pure political theater, formally abdicated his power, and turning to a shocked and reluctant Maximian, who was present for the ceremony, compelled his co-emperor to do the same. A parallel ceremony was being conducted by Maximian in Milan. This was Diocletian's masterstroke. He was not just retiring, he was enforcing the system. The two Augusti would step down, and as the rules of the Tetrarchy dictated, the two Caesars, Galerius and Constantius, would automatically be elevated to the rank of Augustus. They, in turn, were to appoint two new Caesars. This was the moment of truth. Diocletian had one last surprise. The crowd, and especially the young Constantine who was present, fully expected that he and Maxentius would be named the new Caesars. Instead, Diocletian, likely under the heavy influence of Galerius, announced two obscure military men, Maximinus Daia and Flavius Valerius Severus. He had bypassed the sons, sticking to his principle of merit over blood to the very end. With that, he disrobed, descended the tribunal, and was whisked away in a covered carriage, vanishing from the world's stage as abruptly as he had entered it. This finale was not an act of surrender. It was a calculated, revolutionary act intended to prove that the imperial office was just that, an office, not a personal possession. By surrendering power voluntarily, he was trying to sanctify the process, to create a precedent so powerful it could withstand the pressures of dynastic ambition. He was the lawgiver, and his final law was that even he was subject to the system he had created. It was a moment of supreme, almost arrogant faith in his own logical creation, a belief that a perfectly designed political machine could tame the irrational passions of powerful men. It was a gamble that would, within a year, fail in the most spectacular and bloody way possible. The legacy of Diocletian is a study in stark and irreconcilable contradictions. His reputation has been refracted through the prisms of wildly different historical perspectives, creating a figure who is simultaneously a monstrous tyrant and a visionary savior. For the Christian tradition, which for over a millennium shaped the Western view of Roman history, he is nothing less than the Antichrist. Writers like Eusebius and Lactantius, who lived through the Great Persecution, painted him as a blood-crazed demon, a monster who unleashed the most horrific assault on their faith. In this narrative, his debilitating illness and the subsequent collapse of the Tetrarchy into civil war were nothing less than divine retribution, the just punishment of God upon his greatest enemy. This image of Diocletian the persecutor dominated historical memory for centuries. However, beginning with Enlightenment historians like Edward Gibbon, a more secular and administrative interpretation began to emerge. Gibbon, while critical of what he saw as Diocletian's Oriental despotism, acknowledged his formidable talents as a reformer who arrested the decline of the empire. This view has been further developed by modern historians, who now largely see Diocletian through the dispassionate lens of statecraft and administrative science. In this interpretation, he is one of the most significant figures in late antiquity, a revolutionary genius who single-handedly saved the Roman state from certain dissolution. They point to the dominate he created, the fiscal reforms he enacted, and the provincial reorganization he undertook as the foundational pillars upon which the later Roman and Byzantine empires were built. For these administrative historians, the Great Persecution is often treated as a tragic but secondary policy error, a miscalculation in an otherwise brilliant career of state-building. This creates a profound conflict of interpretations. Was he the evil tyrant of Christian martyrology, or the brilliant statesman of academic history? The truth, of course, is that he was both. He was a man whose obsession with order led him to both save a civilization and commit atrocities in its name. His legacy is therefore a mirror, reflecting what different eras value most: religious faith, political liberty, or the cold, hard mechanics of state survival. We can now finally return to the core question, the central dramatic paradox of Diocletian's life. Why did the man who rebuilt the world walk away from it? The answer is not a single thread, but a tapestry woven from his personal psychology, his physical decline, and the very nature of the system he created. He did not walk away because he was a philosopher king like Marcus Aurelius, weary of worldly affairs. He was a pragmatist and an engineer to his very core. The primary reason for his abdication was that it was the final, logical, and necessary function of the machine he had built. The entire purpose of the Tetrarchy was to create a predictable, orderly transfer of power. For Diocletian to die in office, clinging to power until his last breath, would have been to admit his own system's failure. It would have meant that the machine still needed its creator, that it was not the immortal, self-perpetuating entity he intended it to be. His abdication was the ultimate proof of concept, a demonstration of supreme faith in his own creation. He had to step aside to prove the system worked. This profound, almost fanatical devotion to his own systemic logic was compounded by the stark reality of his physical collapse. His illness in 304 had broken him. It shattered his health and, more importantly, his iron will. He, the man of control, had lost control of his own body. He looked at the political landscape and saw the storm that was coming. The seething ambition of Galerius, the reluctance of Maximian, and the simmering threat of the excluded sons, Constantine and Maxentius. He knew a bloody struggle was inevitable, and he no longer possessed the physical stamina or the mental energy to manage it. He was an exhausted architect, handing over the keys to a new, untested set of tenants, knowing they would likely wreck the building, but too tired to stop them. He chose the garden over the throne, not as an act of pastoral sentiment, but as an act of profound, world-weary realism. He had done all he could. He had stopped the apocalypse, rebuilt the empire, and designed a blueprint for its future. The rest was out of his hands. He walked away because his life's work, as he defined it, was complete. The final act was not to rule, but to leave. The ultimate verdict of history on Diocletian is that he was a figure of monumental, tragic, and necessary greatness. His saga is the timeless lesson on the eternal tension between civilization and chaos, and the terrible price that is often paid for order. He was the right man for a desperate time. A less ruthless, less autocratic, less obsessive man would have failed. He inherited a world in freefall, and through sheer force of will, he arrested its descent. The reforms he instituted, while brutal, laid the administrative and military groundwork that allowed the Roman Empire, at least in the East, to survive for another 1,000 years. Without Diocletian, there is no Byzantium. However, the price for this survival was the final death of the old Roman spirit. He saved the empire's body by embalming it, transforming the living, chaotic principate of Augustus into the rigid, hierarchical, and suffocating dominate. He replaced the idea of the citizen with the subject, and the first magistrate with a remote, divine monarch. The state he created was a more efficient, more stable, and more defensible entity, but it was also a colder, more oppressive, and less free one. His life is a monumental testament to the limits of rational design in human affairs. He believed he could create a perfect system that would eliminate the messy, unpredictable variables of human ambition and emotion. But within months of his retirement, his creation shattered into a decade of bloody civil war, as the very sons he had excluded, Constantine and Maxentius, rose up to claim their birthright, proving that blood was thicker than theory. In the end, Diocletian's great machine failed, but the state he rebuilt endured. He is a lesson in the paradox of power, that sometimes, to save something, you must fundamentally change its nature into something almost unrecognizable. He was not the hero Rome wanted, but he was, perhaps, the savior it needed. We are left with the final, haunting frame of this epic saga. The image is not of Diocletian in his purple robes, nor with his sword plunged into a traitor's heart. It is the image of an old man walking through the colonnades of his massive fortress-like palace on the Dalmatian coast, the Adriatic Sea glittering in the distance. He is in his garden, the wind from the sea carrying the scent of salt and rosemary. His hands, which once held the scepter of world power, are now dark with rich soil. He is tending his vegetables. Years after his abdication, as the civil wars he had foreseen raged across the empire, his old colleague Maximian, who had tried and failed to return to power, came to Salona. He begged, pleaded, and cajoled Diocletian to put on the purple once more, to return and restore the order that was collapsing without him. The response of the retired emperor has echoed through the ages, a final, profound verdict on the nature of power and peace. He looked at the desperate, power-hungry man before him, and with a calm that must have been infuriating, replied, "If only you could see the cabbages that I am growing here with my own hands, you would never think of urging me to abandon this happiness for the pursuit of power." In that single sentence lies the entire enigma of Diocletian. The man who had been Jupiter on earth found his final, truest contentment not in commanding armies or dictating laws, but in the simple, creative act of coaxing life from the soil. The shadow of this cabbage-growing god looms large over history, a perpetual question mark, a quiet, ironic rebuke to all who believe that ultimate power is the ultimate prize.